Ave Maris Stella, Dei Mater.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. I'm your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I'm a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 8, where we're going to cover Sacrosanctum Concilium 9 and 10 on the liturgy as the action of the Church. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. Where are we here on day 8 for Sacrosanctum Concilium 9 and 10? We're in chapter 1, which is on the general principles for the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, so general principles. And then we're in the first part of that chapter, or the first section of that chapter, the nature of the sacred liturgy and its importance in the church's life. So that's what we're covering, right? So yesterday we spoke about how Jesus is always present in the liturgy, specifically in the Eucharist, but in the liturgy more broadly as well. And today we're going to talk about the action of the church, because the liturgy is in many ways the action of the church. We as church are the actors in the liturgy in that sense, right? So in the liturgy, the church announces Christ's salvation. It is the summit of Christ's work, and it leads to our holiness. Those are kind of 3 subpoints of the action of the church. So paragraph 9 and 10 are each made of 2 smaller paragraphs. They number these paragraphs, but then they have actual paragraphs in the text, which, like a space between them. So I'm going to read each of the 4 physical paragraphs and in the 2 numbered ones. So let's get into it. Paragraph 9, the 2 parts are conversion and salvation. So let's go to the first part, paragraph 9-1. The sacred liturgy does not exhaust the entire activity of the church. Before men can come to the liturgy, they must be called to faith and conversion. And then it quotes Romans 10. How are they to call upon him who have they not believed? But how are they to believe him who they have not heard? And how are they to hear if no one preaches? And how are men to preach unless they be sent, right? So this is how can this happen, right? This was the famous passage that Augustine picked up when he was in the garden thinking about converting, and he heard the little song of the boy saying, take up and read, right? If you remember the story from the Confessions, I don't know why I forgot Augustine's most famous work, the name of it for a second there, right? So this is what we have here in Romans 10, which is quoted in this number. And here we have the liturgy is key, but it's not all, right? We need to convert people to bring them to the liturgy. The liturgy has a very important effect, bringing upon our salvation, the source and summit, as we'll cover later on in this section. But, we need to convert people beyond just the liturgy. Liturgy can be part of it. If you ever read Scott Hahn's story, he would go to the Catholic Mass, sit in the back, and he'd notice all the different citations of the Bible throughout the liturgy that helped to convert him. So moving on to 9-2, next physical paragraph. Therefore, the church announces that the good tidings of salvation to those who do not believe, so that all men may know the true God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent, and may be converted from their ways, doing penance. To believers also the church must ever preach faith and penance. She must prepare them for the sacraments, teach them to observe all that Christ commands, and invite them in the works of charity, piety, and apostolate. For all these works make it clear that Christ's faithful, though not of this world, are the light of the world, and to glorify the Father before men, right? So we announce salvation to the world. That's what the liturgy is doing, but we do that throughout everything, right? When we have a Catholic charity that's helping out the poor, that's announcing salvation. Proclaim glad tidings to the poor is one of the things that's in the psalm that Jesus says he's fulfilling, right? So all these works, right, are doing these things. So conversion involves that faith and that penance, right? The conversion means to turn towards, turn about, right? And so to convert is that penance, that faith, right? So we have to change our mind, turn around. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about penance. Not so much, I had this penance, that penance, I did this sacrifice. No, but the penance is about reconciliation, that conversion, that turning about, right? And we do that, right? We avoid difficulties. We need to make penance. And this gives those examples, works of charity, piety, and apostolate, right? So we have works of charity, like I was talking about a soup kitchen or helping the poor. We have works of piety, people who help others pray, I've written books on prayer and things like, I've written a book on prayer. I've posted about, spoken about prayer. And then apostolate, how do we serve people? How do we spread the message, right? And this makes us the light of the world, the light set of the lampstand, right? From the Sermon on the Mount. This is what Jesus is calling us to be. Now, paragraph 10, again, has two parts. This paragraph, the two parts, the part one is the summit and the part two is the holiness. So let's read this first. Paragraph 10-1. Nevertheless, liturgy is the summit towards which the activity of the church is directed. At the same time, is the font from which all her power flows. For the aim and object of apostolic works is that all who are made sons of God by faith and baptism should come together to praise God in the midst of his church, to take part in his sacrifice and eat the Lord's Supper, right? So this idea of the source and summit is a key point. If you go to the Catechism, number 1324, which is right at the beginning of the second section on the Eucharist, it quotes Lumen Gentium 11. It says the Eucharist is the source and summit of Christian life, right? So it is the source or the font, the foundation, the kind of where all that water flows from. Think of like a spring or a fountain or something like that, right? And it is that source, but then it's also the goal, the summit, everything that's working towards this, right? All of our other apostolic activity in the church is working towards people receiving the Eucharist, right? Because when I receive the Eucharist, I am in a way a tabernacle, a living tabernacle, because Jesus dwelled body, blood, soul, and divinity inside me in that tabernacle, right? So that's what we talk about as the summit, because in the liturgy we have the peak, the goal, the be all of the Christian life, at least on this side of heaven, and that's what we do, right? But also, this paragraph talks about how we do it coming together. It's not just me and Jesus. As Catholics, it's us and Jesus as well, right? So there are times of prayer where it's me and Jesus. I have my own personal prayer time. But there's a lot of times it's us and Jesus. We have the liturgy, right? The day I'm recording this, I was celebrating Mass for a convent for a bunch of sisters, right? Early in the morning. And you see all the sisters there, and they're all praying together, and they're all singing very beautifully together. I am not a good singer. I kind of like lip sync the songs. Besides the fact that I'm like at least one octave lower than all of them. They're all very high pitched and things like that. But I'm also not a great singer, right? So, but in that sense, they're celebrating the Eucharist together as a group of sisters, and they're together before God. It's not just Sister A before God. It's Sister A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the sisters before God, right? And that is that unity we have in the Eucharist. The Eucharist is not just a me and Jesus, but an us and Jesus moment. So the last paragraph we're going to cover here, 10-2, let's read it now. The liturgy, in its turn, moves the faithful, filled with the Paschal sacraments, to be one in holiness. It prays they may hold fast in their lives what they be grasped by their faith. In the renewal of the Eucharist, the renewal in the Eucharist of the covenant between the Lord and man draws the faithful into complete, compelling love of Christ and sets them on fire. From the liturgy, therefore, and especially from the Eucharist, as from a font, grace is poured forth upon us, and the sanctification of men in Christ and the glorification of God, to which all activities of the church are directed and towards their end, is achieved the most efficacious possible way, right? So we talked here about the Paschal sacraments, right? That was the term that the document used. So Paschal is just another word for Easter. In both our languages, some variation of Passover, which is Pasqua, or something like that in Spanish or Italian or Latin. And so Paschal we get into English, even though we don't say Easterly generally. But this is talking about those sacraments, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that kind of the Triduum we have there, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, just Easter. And really we have the Eucharist there fully. But then we also have things like baptism, right? From the side of Christ, what came forth? Water for baptism and blood for the Eucharist, right? Those are the things that came forth. And that's really amazing that we have those kind of things in there, right? And that's really that kind of indicates the key aspect of those sacraments, right? So these sacraments in general, these Paschal sacraments, strengthen us, moves us to be holy, right? Because part of the goal of the sacrament is to make me holy. The sacrament, right? Sacra meaning holy in Latin, And ment being, the thing that makes it. Like government is the thing that governs. Well, that example might be a little ridiculous because sometimes you're like, the government doesn't really govern. They're totally ineffective. But that's what at least the term means. That term of ment as a suffix, right? So here it is, the sacrament is supposed to make us holy. It renews the covenant, right? It represents the passion, death, and resurrection. We talked about it, I think yesterday, the day before, we talked about anamnesis, that kind of memory that makes things present, not just kind of, it's kind of, but it really makes them present. And this is the core of our sanctification, not all alone. And the sacraments are that source of grace. So that concludes this section. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. I do this on a volunteer basis, and my community relies on donations to pay a lot of our bills. So I'd really appreciate it if you support my community. You can go to patreon.com/frmatthewlc. And there's also a link to make a one-time donation on my own site, frmatthewlc.com. You can also donate to Patreon at sgpn.com/give to support StarQuest. So tomorrow we're going to continue with the next paragraphs in Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is paragraphs 11 to 13. And that's on the liturgy as the action of the church. And we'll finish this section of chapter 1 of Sacrosanctum Concilium. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sgpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SGPN on Facebook or X for more information on the podcast, as just playlists for individual documents and a reading plan.